The soldiers cheered as the train entered Wisconsin. It had been a long trip from the south back to their homes in the north. One soldier had a big red scar on his forehead. Another had an injured leg and could hardly walk. The third soldier, Private Smith, had bright, tired eyes because he had been sick with malaria. The three soldiers spread their blankets on the train seats and tried to sleep. It was a cold evening, even though it was summer. Private Smith, still weak from his sickness, shivered in the cool night air. He felt happy to go home, but he was also worried. He was weak and tired. How would he take care of his family? Could he do the hard work of farming again? He had given 3 years of his life to the army, but now he had little strength and no money. The sun slowly rose, lighting up the sky in pale yellow. The train slowed down as it arrived at the town of La Crosse. This was where the three soldiers would leave the train. The station was empty because it was Sunday. Smith smiled to himself. "I'll be home in time for Sunday dinner," he thought. The three soldiers got off the train. Smith turned to his friends. "Well, boys, this is goodbye. We've walked many miles together, but now it's time to go home." The men looked at each other, unsure of what to say. One of them spoke up. "We should walk home with you. That bag looks heavy, and you're not strong." "I'll be fine," Smith said, adjusting his army cap. "Every step gets me closer to home." The three men shook hands. "Goodbye, good luck," they said to each other. Then Smith turned and started walking. After a few steps, he waved back at his friends, and they waved too before heading in different directions. Smith walked on, thinking about his friends and their time in the war. He remembered Billy Tripp, his closest friend, who had been killed in battle. "I'll have to tell his mother and wife," he thought sadly. It was a memory he would never forget. After a while, the houses and fields started to look familiar. He was getting close to home. As he climbed the last hill, the sun burned hot in the sky, but he didn't care. At the top, he stopped and looked down at his farm in the valley below. He was almost home. Mrs. Smith, Private Smith's wife, lived alone on the farm with their 3 children. Mary was 9, Tommy was 6, and little Teddy was 4. That Sunday morning, Mrs. Smith was feeding the chickens when she saw the broken fence again. She had tried to fix it so many times. She sat down and cried. The man who was supposed to take care of the farm while her husband was away had been lazy and dishonest. Now, the fields were full of wheat, but there was no one to harvest it. 6 weeks earlier, her husband had written that he would come home soon. Every day, she looked down the road, hoping to see him, but he hadn't come. Feeling lonely, Mrs. Smith decided to visit her neighbor, Mrs. Gray. She quickly dressed the children and locked the house before heading to the Gray family's farm. Mrs. Gray, a widow with many children, was a kind and cheerful woman. When she saw Mrs. Smith and the children, she welcomed them warmly. "Come in, we're about to have dinner," she said. The house was full of noise and laughter. Mrs. Smith and her children joined the family for a big meal of potatoes, corn, apple pie, and more. After eating, the women stayed at the table for tea. "Tell us our futures, Mama," one of Mrs. Gray's daughters begged, holding up her teacup. Mrs. Gray laughed and looked at the tea leaves. "I see a handsome man in your future," she teased, making her daughter laugh. When it was Mrs. Smith's turn, Mrs. Gray looked into her cup and said seriously, "Someone is coming home to you. He's carrying a rifle, and he's almost there." Mrs. Smith gasped. At that moment, Mrs. Gray pointed out the window. "There he is!" Mrs. Smith ran to the door and saw a man in a blue coat walking down the road toward her farm. His face was hidden by a large bag on his back. Laughing and crying, she grabbed her children and ran after him, calling his name. When she reached the farm, she found him standing by the fence, looking at the fields and the little house. Private Smith turned and saw his wife running toward him. He dropped his bag and hugged her tightly. "Emma!" he cried. The children stood back, unsure. Then Smith knelt down and pulled 3 shiny red apples from his bag. The children ran to him, laughing. Together, the family went into the little house. Later that evening, after supper, Smith and his wife sat outside. The moon shone brightly, and stars filled the peaceful sky. The farm needed work, and life would not be easy. But Private Smith had faced many challenges before. Now he was home, and he was ready to start again.